But TLDR, if your entire process of economics is to cut costs as much as possible, the easiest place to cut costs is labor. If you do not care about the dignity and worth of human beings, you can always find bodies. You can trick them. You can exploit them. You can manipulate them. You can always find bodies. Other things have fixed cost. Rent has fixed cost. Supplies have fixed cost. But if you want to, you can delude yourself into believing that labor has flexible costs. Everybody, we're the Good Doctors of Abbey Research. I'm Dr. Kristen.
And I'm Dr. Erin.
And you are welcome to our discussion this week on racism and slavery in Brazil. You may be asking yourself, why? Why are we doing that?
Why are you welcome?
Such an excellent question. Why do you want to be part of it? Why are we doing it? So this is part of our Colonizers World Tour, where we have spent the last year and a half, and will continue to do so until we run out of countries, intentionally looking at the history, legacy, implications of colonization in various countries around the world. We are in our second year of doing it, or our second book, as we often say, and our second chapter of our second book, where we're spending the whole month of April 2022 focusing on Brazil. So last week we talked about the government and the economy and the system of politic there. This week we're doing slavery. Next week we're going to be talking about gender. And finally we're going to wrap up talking about sport, and specifically the World Cup and the Olympics and that kind of span of 2014 to 2017. And we'll be talking about why so many scholars make the argument that football is truly Brazil's national cohesive identity and its civic religion. So we'll be talking about that last. But this week is for talking about its other civic religion, which is racism. Lots of things to discuss here. I think this topic, honestly, is what led us to say we need a whole month on Brazil.
Yeah.
And then, ironically, I didn't find any new information. I just kept finding more details on the terrible stuff we learned last year.
Yeah.
So, in terms of what you knew before you went in, anything, E?
Yeah, I mean, what we learned last year, so I knew that it was bad. I knew that, very complicated. And then I think what I learned this week was that it was way worse than I ever knew.
Yeah, I think that's mine as well. I'm looking at my notes right here. I believe the way that I typed it was, what did I know about slavery and racism in Brazil before research? That it was bad. And that I learned a lot from last year, but we're diving in this year. And I think the thing I was the most unprepared for was the current state of modern day slavery. Yeah. That somehow, even in all the conversations last year about the state of terribleness for women, there wasn't a big conversation in the resources we found last year about human trafficking and sexual exploitation of women and girls. No. And I was a little bit surprised, I'll be honest, that we didn't run across that before. So that was an interesting thing coming into it. But a couple things we did know is that 40% of the transatlantic slave trade ended up in Brazil. It's about 4 million people. And that is compared to around 5% of the transatlantic slave trade ending up in the United States. Uh-huh. So one of the questions we kept asking each other last year was, so why does it look so different? Like, why do we pretend that we have the bulk of the slave trade? Like, how did this all happen? We have some answers and a lot more questions because that's what true research does. So let's do a little bit of background here. Like we said, there was around 4 million enslaved folks, if we kind of take it all together, until 1888, which is when they abolished slavery. It is the last country in the known world to abolish slavery in 1888.
Yep.
Throughout that entire span of slavery, though, we had slaves escaping. We had slave revolts. We had slaves being like, play it please, this is not where I'm from. I'd like to go home. Brazil is huge and massive, and so one of the things about the revolts in Brazil is that it was a lot easier for them to run into the rainforest and create their own communities than in the United States, where you were either running into giant mountains or the ocean. So it was just more conducive to hiding. So we have now what are called Quilombo Communities, which is communities of escaped slaves, of freed slaves, depending on what time we're talking about. And there's around 6,000 communities, and Aaron's going to get into this a little bit more later on, so I'll hit pause on Quilombo. The real key to understanding slavery and its legacy in Brazil is that there was never a formalized Jim Crow system. So there was never an apartheid system. There was no codified racial segregation in the way you see in the United States or South Africa. Instead, it was a lot more insidious. It was a lot more... The other thing that I think is different than the United States is that in the United States, by the times the slave trade really kicked off, we had exterminated most of the other people in communities of color. So it was a lot of African folks coming into really white spaces, which is not the case in Brazil. It was a lot of African folks coming into already mixed race spaces. Because with the Portuguese and some other and indigenous intermarrying and intermingling and kind of all this stuff, they already had a category for mixed race called pardo. Like they already had that. That's not something that legally we even acknowledged until do we even now? I don't know when we finally put mixed race on the census, but it cannot have been early on.
No, because it was still like mixed race marriages were illegal into what, the 1960s?
I think so,
50s?
yeah. So.
Yeah.
So this is just a different context in which you're coming in. The Portuguese, in order to escape Napoleon, as a reminder, in order to escape Napoleon, the Portuguese took their entire court to Rio de Janeiro for the length of the Napoleonic Wars. And then they didn't really want to go back. Like, they were pretty happy in Brazil. So they left their son to hang out and rule Brazil. Then when Brazil got independence, he didn't really leave. He just like helped them transition into a government that he was still kind of in charge of. So we're talking about completely different dynamics here. So when did a lot of white folks actually show up en masse? It's not until the 1940s when industrialization really takes over. And that's when you start to get, I mean, they've always had immigration. I'm not saying there's not, and I'm not saying there weren't white folks, but in terms of mass white folk immigration, it's not until the 40s. So that changes a little bit of what's going on. And what happened at that point is instead of a codified racial system, you just whitewashed all of Brazil. Because they couldn't let the black folks get in charge, and I don't even think they used black folk at the time. I think there was another word. I think they said part of those, I think, in some of the stuff I've seen. You couldn't let them get power of these new industrialized operations. We were cool with them having power over their little farms. That was fine. It wasn't that big of a threat. But now we're talking about mass rubber plantations. And we're talking about mass sugar exportation, mass coffee exportation. We're talking about a lot of money. We can't let black folks have a lot of money. That's not possible.
Nope.
So what they set up instead of a codified legal system was a codified social system called racial democracy. And the argument they began to make was that because we have so many races, that's what makes Brazil so great. And they sold the myth, and by they I mean the government and those in power and the 9 families that control the media, sold the myth that there isn't any difference in the races. There's not really racism because we celebrate all races here.
Yeah.
That's lasted for like 15, 20 years. And finally in the 1960s, a whole lot of people were like, bullshit. That's not how this actually works here. But then, again, another difference from the United States. Instead of like mass riots and we kind of get distrust in systems and we see the 60s in America, they got a military dictatorship.
So instead of a civil rights movement, they got dictatorship. Goes well.
So we have a military dictatorship for 20 odd years. In 1998, we get the new constitution. In 1988, excuse me, we get the new constitution, and they do make racism illegal. Amazing. This is where I always kind of like laugh at hate crime legislation because I just don't know how you legislate on people's minds, brains, opinions, or anything. I just don't know how you do it. So racism is illegal. Cool. And yet we have rampant police brutality. So it's one of those like, thanks, but
like,
can
how
we
do you
not pretend
how do you
that
enforce
solves
that?
anything?
Like, yeah, how do you enforce that?
You don't. It's why we need hate crime legislation, not hate thought legislation. Anyway. So that's the thing. So then in 1995, they redefined slavery to include a lot of different definitions because they realized that there was actually slavery still happening within their bounds. The issue is they redefined it, they kind of fought it, and then they didn't. Lula, who, if you remember, if you joined us last week, was the very progressive, long-serving, in terms of politics and labor rights, the progressive politician, he still didn't like necessarily eradicate modern-day slavery. Didn't really do anything for the textile industry, from what I can find. Didn't really regulate sweatshops. Was a whole lot more concerned with construction, which, again, we need to remind you that part of emerging from a dictatorship means that a lot of bribes and kickbacks and how things worked in the dictatorship still are trying to work within democracy. And so it's a very messy system. So perhaps he didn't have the capital to go after sweatshops. Perhaps he didn't care. Rio is the seat of Latin American fashion. All of the cheap, fast fashion in Latin America comes from Rio. So it's obviously a massive moneymaker. By the time we hit the mid-2000s, there's some 2010s, excuse me, there's some international recognition that they are doing a whole lot to fight slavery. They're doing, they're finding that indigenous men have been enslaved for a decade, 2 decades to destroy the rainforest, that's who is the labor of the rainforest destruction is indigenous men and boys. And there's some noise about doing things about it. They do some things about it. And then in 2016, we get Jair Bolsonaro. He is not interested in eradicating slavery because it does not fit his economic policy. In fact, having more slaves, and I'll say this, really interestingly, the CEO of Applebee's sent out an email this week as we're talking, which is the 25th. Aaron and I are recording the 25th of March, 2022. Applebee's sent out a thing that said essentially like gas prices and everything going down is really, really good because we can start paying people less. So this isn't, I'm not saying that Applebee's is employing slaves, but they're definitely not paying people a living wage. And so there's a lot of steps between bond, indentured servitude, slavery, and not being paid a living wage. And we're going to get into that a little bit tomorrow with our coverage of the movie Seven Prisoners and where everyone falls along those and how people get into this. But TLDR, if your entire process of economics is to cut costs as much as possible, the easiest place to cut costs is labor. If you do not care about the dignity and worth of human beings, you can always find bodies. You can trick them. You can exploit them. You can manipulate them. You can always find bodies. Other things have fixed cost. Rent has fixed costs. Supplies have fixed cost. But if you want to, you can delude yourself into believing that labor has flexible costs. So when you set up the economic boon that Bolsonaro is trying to set up, when you have the economy of restaurant workers in the United States that we have, we should not be surprised by these attitudes at all. They are both feeding grounds for human trafficking, which happens in the United States. It's happening now. The charity and the slave trade, along with a lot of others, tell us that there are now about approximately 3 times as many slaves right now as there were at the height of the slave trade internationally. And we're not talking about it because it's weird, and we would love to believe that slavery ended. And it is not based on race, this slavery. This slavery is based on economic opportunity and gender exploitation. So when we think about Brazil now, we've got to talk about that racial democracy. So that's a thing to think about. The second is that for a long time, and I think still in the census, you are allowed to self-identify your race. Which then there's a great Vox video in the resource lists below about people who all of us would look at them and be like, oh, they're all black. And they're picking different racial identities at a, I think, more, I want to say higher rate than anywhere else I've ever seen. The difference of how you emotionally, there was one little boy that talked about the fact that like until he went to college, he didn't know he was black because his mom shaved his hair all the time. So he didn't know that he was black until he started growing out his black hair. I've certainly not heard that kind of story in the United States.
No.
So that's a particular feature of Brazil. There is also massive and high police brutality, just like and higher, honestly, in the statistics I'm reading, than the United States, significantly higher. Brazil is also understood to be a violent society. It's almost forgiven for being so violent because it's just like, oh, that's Brazil. And then modern day slavery. We have a lot of modern day slavery in agriculture. We have a lot of it in industry. We have a lot of, and then we have the sexual exploitation of women and girls. Women and girls are treated as payment, more than money. Again, you can always find bodies. You can always find bodies. So there's a lot of problems there. So I'll pause my voice here and let Erin jump in and tell you some other terrible things before we say goodbye for the day.
Oh boy. I mean, we knew when we wanted to do a specific month on Brazil that we would have a lot to say, and that it was a very complicated situation, especially about slavery and racism. And there's a great kind of contextual resource in our list that you can access below that's about a brief history of race in Latin America that does a really great job of distinguishing between what happened in Spanish America. So Spain colonized most of America, the part that we didn't colonize and Brazil didn't colonize. It was mostly Spain. And so specifically looking at Latin America, and so Spanish and Brazilian and Portuguese America. So make sure and check that out if you have 20 minutes of your time. This guy does a great job of drawing while he's talking and putting words up. It's very visually interesting, but explains a lot of these racial differences that Dr. Kristen got into that create a specific circumstance for folks in Brazil. So, you know, as per usual, when I was looking into how slavery and racism impacted Indigenous folks, I mean, it's not great. It's never great. We know that social scientists have designated that there were over 500 Amerindian groups. So that's like, you know, the indigenous groups, they're called Amerindian, in Central and South America. So we don't really know a lot of what happened to them specifically. We know they suffered disproportionate impacts from slavery. They weren't necessarily the enslaved folks at the start of the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade in what became Brazil, because they brought over the black folks to do it. But what happened was a lot of the indigenous folks got displaced. So there's loss of land, sovereignty, the impact on their climate. The impact on the climate impacts their economy, their sustainability. There's the spreading of disease and death, which happens often when Europeans come. They brought all their disease and death to the indigenous populations in what was Brazil and what became Brazil. So a lot of the indigenous groups moved inland because the Portuguese basically colonized along the coast. And they didn't go as far inland, and Brazil's a big old place. So, you know, as Dr. Kristen mentioned, the Quilombo communities as well, they just were like, if we go far enough interior,
they can't find us.
They can't find us. There's too much land. They won't be able to find us. And I mean, I think that might have happened more in the United States if the western climate, like the climate in the western part of the United States wasn't so like severe.
Yeah.
But you know, we had indigenous folks all over what is now the United States. So, you know, the situation with the Quilombos is really interesting now because again, we have this push for agribusiness that's come in the last decade or so, in the last 20 years, but then certainly has been emphasized under Bolsonaro's government. And so there's a lot of agribusiness that is interested in the land. So as we are moving businesses and the continued colonization further inland into the rainforest, the businesses are now encountering the Quilombos, they're encountering the indigenous folks. So that is all happening. You know, Bolsonaro isn't a big fan of people who aren't white. So it was just never really going to go well. Or men. Yeah, it's just never really going to go well. In terms of human rights, which is something we often talk about when we do these focuses. You know, human rights and slavery, right? It's nothing but chocolate chip cookies. So one of the things that I learned that I thought was interesting and worth sharing was that the average age for an enslaved person working on a sugar plantation in the 1800s was 23. And so one of the ways in which Brazil was very different from other parts of the Americas that had enslaved folks was that the working conditions were so bad in Brazil that enslaved people just died. And so they brought more enslaved people. Whereas in the United States, they realized, like, oh, if we don't treat them so bad and, you know, we rape them or let them have families, then they produce more slaves. So there's a lot
saves us money on the ships.
Yeah, it's the economy of it, really. Obviously, both sarcastically and literally. So that's why we have a different kind of relationship with descendants and ancestry and the Black self-identification, which is really, really interesting and important to remember. So conditions were so bad in Brazil, they just died and replaced the dead slaves with more slaves. And that coincides with the fact that what Kristen brought up earlier, that they didn't institutionalize the racism like we did in the United States, like they did in South Africa. There was still so much systemic discrimination, but then you get this myth of racial democracy that comes in as well. And so there's a very confused and suppressed understanding of Blackness.
I love that word, confused. I think that's so strong, and we haven't used it yet. That's a great word. Yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, that comes up a couple of times in that great Vox video where people were like, I didn't know I was Black until I was 25. Or like what it means to be Black. And so it's such a interesting way to look at, you know, the complicated web of identification and how the impacts of colonization and the slave trade are felt differently depending on how those played out. So, you know, again, there's the old slavery and the new slavery, and the new slavery is pretty damn terrible. So we have slavery-like conditions across the spectrum of industries in Brazil now: coffee, fashion, textiles, deforestation, agribusiness. There's a whole half-hour article on like charcoal farming and how people are enslaved in charcoal farming. Human trafficking is a massive problem. Massive problem. You know, and we had the impact from the Constitution, in the end of the military dictatorship. Lula did establish a secretariat for racial equality, and we've got several universities have established affirmative action policies based on race. But when you have this confused and suppressed understanding of race, you know, you can make all the policies in the world and you can still have a problem with figuring out what equity looks like. And when you can manipulate people based on class and economic viability, that falls a lot of the time on racial lines. But it's kind of coming at it from a different angle. So the influence of colonization, I think the point that I wanted to make about this was, you know, when we look at the colonization of the Americas, we've got these three main people groups, like the colonizers, the Europeans, the Black Africans, and the indigenous folks. There's always lots of intermixing, both without consent and with consent. And there's a real complex hierarchy and history of social status. And that has evolved throughout the period of colonization and the period of enslavement and afterwards. And so there's never like, you can't look at Brazil or look at Colombia or look at Guatemala or look at the United States and say, oh, this is how it worked in a line from A to B. So I think contextually, that's what I would want to say about the impact and the influence of colonization. Like, we have to remember, and then within these people groups, depending on where they came from in Europe and or what their what the land looked like and the climate and the possibility for all of the colonization or the indigenous livelihoods, all of that impacts then the race relations and how slavery impacted that land. So I think that's the last thing I'll wrap up with. Things are real bad now. Real bad now. We saw a lot of Black Lives Matter protests in Brazil as well. So, again, I have hope for the youths.
I always have hope for the youths.
Always have hope for the youths. Since the election of Bolsonaro, since the drastic and dramatic rise in police brutality and violence, and the global protests in Black Lives Matter certainly appeared and made an impact in Brazil. So again, we're having an election. Because now you and I are that involved in Brazil is having an election in October of 2022. So all eyes on Brazil in this election to see where the country swings in terms of a lot of these bigger social and economic issues. Dr. Kristen, what is your Jeopardy fact for this particular exploration into Brazil?
I think it's going to be the white folks coming in mass in the 40s. Like, that was a real...
Brazil has a fascinating history of immigration, man.
Like, I was like, oh, well, of course they did. Why would they go before that? And, I mean, if I'm an industrialist in London, and I just survived the Blitz, and do I want to rebuild in London, or do I want to go to Rio? I'll tell you right now, I want to go to Rio.
I know.
Like, honestly.
There's a whole, like... And we've got videos in the Google Doc, folks, that are like, there's a whole reason why there's a bunch of Syrian and Palestinian immigrants to Brazil, and then like Japanese immigrants.
There's this massive Japanese population in Brasilia, evidently. Like, okay, cool,
it's
love
just
it.
Like the movement of people from all over the world to Brazil is one of the most interesting things.
Yeah, so I think that's mine, is that it wasn't this, like, massive influx until the 40s. What about you?
For me, it was the history of Quilombos, but also, like, what's happening to them now. So that was really interesting. And I don't think I brought this up, but, like, the Quilombos were protected under the 1988 Constitution. And so the Constitution guaranteed that descendants of escaped or freed enslaved folks could keep the land that they formed the Quilombos on. And now they're having their constitutional rights violated by all the agribusiness. So there's a couple really interesting videos that I watched just about what life looks like in the Quilombos and how they feel about being Brazilian, and how they are kind of protecting and furthering their cultural associations and the history of their family members who were enslaved and escaped. It's really, really interesting. So that was definitely my Jeopardy fact.
All right. Well, pals, good news. Tomorrow is even worse, or next in the playlist. So we're going to be talking about the Netflix movie, the Netflix 2021 movie, 7 Prisoners. It is exceptionally well made and an exceptionally hard sit. Talking about modern day slavery among young men laborers in between rural Brazil and Sao Paulo, and the movement of bodies in that process. In the meantime, what we'd really appreciate, as always, is if A, you have anything to say about this, you either say it below or let us know you want to say it on camera so that we can have a conversation. We love conversations. We'd really appreciate liking and subscribing here on the channel. That would be a real treat. And help us get this video out to more. YouTube loves a thumbs up, and therefore so do we. If we see you tomorrow, we hope that you bring some deep emotional reserves, and we will guide you through our grief and anger as well. But our hope for you, as always, is that you are somewhere where you have the freedom of choice and the safety of personhood, and that at no point in time you need to choose between selling your body and eating food, as we have learned so many Brazilians have to do right now. Mm-hmm. So may we both understand and honor our own difficulties and our own trauma and keep them within a global perspective of recognizing that many things can be true at once. And then figure out how to leverage our privilege for power, which is the whole point of Colonizer's World Tour. Thanks so much for joining us, guys. We'll see you next time.